I am so excited to tell you about space archaeology that this is the 7th time I have recorded this intro because I'm trying so hard to bring the energy down just a little bit to not scare people away. Space archaeology. It takes dead people and space and brings them together, and I get to tell you about it, and I'm really, really excited. And I know that your first thought is going to be, is she gonna talk about the aliens? So I need to tell you right up front to warn the hashtag real archaeology people. It's not about the aliens. But I am kind of hoping the hashtag real archaeology people come along just to see whether or not I'm secretly going to talk about aliens. But no, there are no aliens in my space archaeology video. But there are people colonizing space. How has humanity impacted the universe? And what will archaeologists of the future think about that? My name's Joanna, I'm an historian, and this is a history book I think you'll love. One of my goals with this channel is to convince people to read history books that might be a bit out of their comfort zones. Now, whether that's my fellow historians wondering why a book about space junk would be at all relevant to their interest, because it's cool, or if you're a non-historian with an interest in archaeology but are a bit intimidated by reading something written by a professional archaeologist because you think of these sorts of books as being very dense and hard to engage with, I want to show you how great these books can be. Now, part of what I talked about when I reviewed the book on demonic possession in 17th century Canada was about how a history book can be easier to engage with if you have someone to follow through the story with. A main character of sorts. Well, that book was about Barb and the suspicious Miller. The main character of this book, Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe, is the author herself, Alice Gorman. This book is in part a memoir about how she found her way through archaeology to space archaeology, and a lot of her childhood trajectory, even though she's both older than me and she's in Australia, reminds me of mine. We were both girls who were influenced by wanting to understand the world around us, and also, dead people are cool. Just imagine, I could have been a space archaeologist instead of the world's leading expert on blind girls in pre-World War I Canada. Imagine how much prouder my parents would be. But this book is also a great dive into what archaeology actually is. I have spent my life thinking archaeology means digging up sand in Egypt, and obviously a lot of archaeology is about digging up historically significant dirt. But what this book does is explain how archaeology is about meaning, about how objects tell us what matters to a society, both historically and in the present, and about how finding literal garbage is a treasure trove of information. It's about how archaeology can give us some guidance as we move out of this era of space being about information and telecommunication and into an era of space tourism for the obscenely wealthy. And she does that by taking us through this journey of objects around the world and literally floating in space above this that gives space meaning. One thing I really love about this book is that it gives a history of the space race from a very different point of view. It does it by looking at significant objects rather than significant events. Sure, she talks about launching man into the moon and talks a lot about the dust that comes back when they returned. But she also discusses so many objects that were created in places other than the US and the USSR. I learned so much about Australia's engagement with space, including how a bunch of college students decided to build a little satellite with stuff they found in junk piles, and they sent that little satellite into space, and they turned it on, and it did things. It did specifically the things that they told it to do, and that satellite is still up there. It's not really doing anything anymore except floating about, but they sent it into space, and it worked. It's called Australia's Oscar 5, and it was remote controlled, and it had the ability to collect and transmit data back down to Earth, and they baked part of it in an oven. I have an oven. I could bake things that go into space. Why did I not know about this stuff? Because everything I've learned about space and space exploration has been through a particular lens, as we like to say in history, and that lens has been, look at how competition between two global superpowers improved technology because they were both trying to prove military and ideological supremacy, and the US won, and that's all that matters. So what does that all mean? What actually is space archaeology? This isn't the only book on the topic I've read, But the way I understand the term is it can be about using satellite imagery and all the technology that comes with that to find archaeology sites. But that's not what this book is about. This is a book about the things we've left behind in the space race and using them to understand and give meaning to space, including space junk. She has this great line in the book that I think about a lot, that heritage is about things in the past that are relevant to the present, that people want to keep into the future. She talks about how objects and technology are a window into the world that produced those objects. And at first you might be thinking, what, it's been like 50 years or something, maybe a few more, since we started exploring space? Do we really need a window into understanding that relatively recent past? My mom was alive when we landed on the moon. Does it really need an archaeological dig? And what Gorman does in this book is she shows you why we do. What gives space meaning? What shapes the narrative of space? How is that history of space different if we look at objects rather than events? Now, I first read this book in the summer of 2020, which was a whole thing. But since then, I've thought a lot about 2 chapters, and I think talking about those chapters can make it clear why I think space archaeology is so cool and why I think you will enjoy this book. And probably most importantly, what Gorman means when she says she's using objects to explain the meaning we've given to space. And the big one, the one that gets me all hyped up, is her chapter on space trash. Both the trash that our space exploration has left here on Earth and the sheer amount of space junk we've sent out into the solar system and beyond. So much of archaeology is looking at trash. So let's talk about some of that trash that's orbiting our planet, that's sitting out on Mars, that's hanging out on the asteroids. And poor little Voyager, literally trying its best to call home. But before I do that, I should tell you to like and subscribe. They tell me if I want my channel to grow, I need you to do that. So like, subscribe, share, all right, back to the learning. So the chapter I've spent so many of my hours thinking about focuses on the idea of space junk and what we can and should do about it. Gorman talks about this in 3 different ways that really get into the heart of what this book is about. The first one is the scary way. There is a lot of debris circling Earth right now, and that debris varies from tiny little things all the way to the remains of shuttle launches. And what's the big deal, right? Most of it is not going to come back down to Earth, and if it does start to come back down, it'll burn up in the atmosphere, and if it's too big to burn up, we'll see it coming. And it turns out there are 2 big deals. The first big deal is that it is dangerous up there. And while I am not going into space, we do still send people and unmanned crafts and apparently cockroaches. And all that junk has the possibility of hitting things and causing some serious damage. Things could explode. People could die. That would be sad. Which leads into the second big deal, which is called Kessler syndrome. Kessler syndrome, as I understand it, still not a space person, is the possibility that the giant space junk could hit other giant space junk and break up so there's more space junk out there. And as the junk takes up more and more space, it becomes more and more difficult, if not impossible, to send anything through the debris into orbit or beyond because it'll hit things and it will explode. No more satellites. No more spaceships. No more cockroaches. The cockroaches will probably be fine. But it might become too dangerous for decades or even centuries to try to send anything up there again. And while that's an extreme scenario, it's not an impossible one. It's not improved by some countries, the United States, Russia, China, doing experiments to prove that they can blow up satellites from Earth, which just makes more debris and makes more problems. It's a thing. The next thing she talks about is the heritage value of space junk. Remember, she's an archaeologist, and my favorite thing about this book is that she talks us through her growing understanding of space as a heritage site that deserves to be valued. And as part of that, she talks about how much of our heritage, things that are significant to us, are floating around up there. I mean, I already talked about amateur satellites from Australia that people built with a bunch of stuff they found lying around. But one of the things floating up there is this satellite called TRAC. TRAAC, that got launched up there in the 1960s. It's historically significant. I am an historian. I can tell you it's historically significant, right? And part of why it's historically significant is because about a year after it got launched, a high-altitude nuclear test went off underneath it. And it damaged it. So it's damage with scars from this type of experiment that we have since outlawed. You are not allowed to do high altitude nuclear tests anymore because we decided that space is only for peace. This is a moment in time that tells us about that change. And it's just floating around up there. Track represents part of our changing understanding of place. Before, space, it was always okay to test weapons in, and now that's illegal. And that might not seem like a big deal to you, so let me tell you a different part. Track is also the first example we have of humans sending poetry into space. There is a poem etched into the panels that make up Track about sending the warmth of human love into the coldness of space. And I think that's beautiful and worth preserving. But how do we do that? How do we do space archaeology? What does it mean to preserve heritage in space, to want to preserve that heritage in its proper context as stuff in the sky that has significance, emotional significance, historical significance, in a world that calls it junk? And Gorman talks about her growing understanding of the complexity of this question and how, as an archaeologist, she's working through the things she needs to think about to address it. And that's why I think this is a great book for someone who is interested in archaeology but isn't really sure what it entails. Gorman walks you through that while also hooking it all into space, which is cool. It's neat. It's full of stars. And we should all be reaching out for our little cup of stars. The third thing Gorman talks about is the environmental impact of all of this. How do we measure the impact of the stuff in the sky? How do we keep people safe when the environment is up in space? What do we need to do to deal with all the stuff that's up there? Who gets to decide? She talks about how what's up there is satellites that work, satellites that don't work, the rocket stages that delivered them, bolts, canisters, fairings, exploded fragments, flecks of paint, poop. There's space poop. There's just so much of it, and we're sending it out into the universe. We have fundamentally changed space forever. How do we clean that up? How do we make sure that space doesn't become polluted just because there's so much of it and it's easy to forget what's hanging in the sky? And that's another thing that archaeologists need to think about. Part of archaeology is environmental impact down here on Earth. So how does that translate into space? Now, the other chapter I think about all the time is the one on the future of space archaeology. I find myself thinking about this when I can't sleep. It does not help with not being able to sleep, as you will soon understand, but it has stuck with me through 4 very difficult years. The final chapter of this book considers the archaeology of the future. We have sent these bits of material culture. That is what historians call things. This bottle cap is material culture. We have sent these bits into the darkness of space. These things tell a history of us, of the meaning we've given to space in our presence. There is hope. There is light against the darkness in these little satellites we send out. There is a true belief that the universe itself is vast and worth understanding, and that we, in our smallness, are worth trying to understand it. Archaeology is about understanding the meaning that people in the past gave to their lives. It looks at artifacts, it looks at trash, it looks at the meaning we leave behind and the ways we memorialize ourselves to understand that meaning. Gorman ends her book by asking what archaeologists of the future will think about the artifacts we leave behind in space. What will they assume about the ways we've sent ourselves into the darkness? Curiosity on Mars sings itself happy birthday every year. What does that say about the people who sent it out there? What do the footprints left on the moon forever tell the future about our past? What does it mean that we've surrounded ourselves with a graveyard of satellites that still, every so often, try to call home? I joke that I'm only interested in dead people, and frankly, so are archaeologists. We study the past to give meaning to the present. Gorman ends her book in a way that reminds me that we are constantly sending meaning into the future, because we do think the present moment has meaning, and that meaning is worth, at least in part, sending into the darkness for the future to come across and remember what we were, and remember that we were here. And we thought that poetry and songs and science and exploration were valuable. She has this line near the end of the chapter: "Different futures can't be imagined without understanding the diversity of the past. There are so many ways of connecting to space, and the stories we tell about space make a difference. A big goal of this book, as I see it, is to get people to start thinking about what archaeology actually is. All of my joking about #RealArchaeology aside, I do still have this view of archaeology being it belongs in a museum. But this book makes it clear that archaeology is so much more than that. If we're going to look at how we create meaning, there's a lot of things to think about. This book talks about how food has been influenced by our fascination with space, from astronaut ice cream to Sputnik-inspired hot dogs to cupcakes with stars on them. It looks at how playgrounds were affected by the space race. Did you want to be an astronaut when you were a kid? Did you have a playground where you could climb up a rocket ship? Because I did, and I still kind of want to be an astronaut. These are other ways of thinking about how we give meaning to things. When I think about how space has meaning, I think about people like me who get emotional, that curiosity up on Mars sings itself happy birthday, that damned XKCD comic about it being a good robot like they want it before it was abandoned on Mars. I think about people who worry that Voyager 2 might stop calling home and all the people who have worked to try and make sure it still can. I think about how John and Hank Green give us the latest news from Mars, and it turns out I care about the latest news from Mars. I think about tiny little me watching the news of the Challenger disaster and not really comprehending what had just happened. These things too are heritage, and public-facing archaeology is part of the commemoration of that. Alice Gorman works really hard on engaging the public with her work. She's got this great blog called Dr. Space Junk, and she's been on some great podcasts, like there's an episode of Ologies that I'm going to recommend you listen to. She wants you to see the value in thinking about how various countries and communities through time represent their vision of space and the universe through things like playgrounds and food and stamps and music and museums and cave paintings and stories and maps. She wants you to think about how heritage tells us what we value and want to send into the future, and how you and I, who are probably not space archaeologists, can shape the future of space by valuing that meaning. I don't want space to be a playground for the rich. And I don't want us to somehow get trapped here forever because too much junk is orbiting for future generations to ever leave. This book made me care about satellites, and not just in the poor Voyager out in the cold dark sort of way, but why do we have so much stuff up there? And how is it affecting what we see? I hope it will do the same for you. Thank you so much for watching this video. I clearly love talking about this, and you have probably saved the nice people at my local bookstore from listening to yet another rant about space archaeology. Poor Charles. Luckily, he'll never see this. I'm thinking my next one might be about the lesbian relationship from Civil War era US. That's a bit upsetting because we only know what we do about it because it ends really badly. Everyone I talk about is dead, but these people are very dead. Or maybe I'll talk about quilts and the history of botany. I've already started reading about a murder quilt to add to that one, so there's more information to talk about. And one of the people who works at my favorite coffee shop asked me really kindly if I could talk about quilts, so maybe I'll do that. We'll see how the mood strikes me. If you have an opinion, you can let me know in a comment. Comments make me feel warm and fuzzy, and it is winter in Ontario, so warm and fuzzy would be great right now. That all said, be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and tell your pets I said hi.